Good evening, wanderers of the digital realm. Tonight, we descend into the shadowed corridors of ancient Greece, where gods walked among mortals and divine justice was as unpredictable as lightning itself. This is not merely a collection of myths, but a journey through the twisted labyrinth of cosmic punishment, where a single word spoken in error could doom entire bloodlines, where jealousy transformed beautiful maidens into monsters, and where the very act of seeking truth became its own torment. Welcome to the vault of the most bizarre, cruel, and ironically poetic curses ever conceived by human imagination. Before we begin unraveling these twisted tales of divine punishment, drop a comment below and tell me what corner of the world you're watching from and what time it is. Consider it your own small ritual before entering the cursed vault of myth. Are you watching from the misty shores of England at midnight? The sun-drenched beaches of California at noon? The bustling streets of Tokyo as dawn breaks? Share your temporal offering, for time itself plays a crucial role in these eternal punishments we're about to explore. Chapter 1. The Architect of Eternal Hunger. In the beginning, there was Tantalus, a king so favored by the gods that he dined at their table, shared their nectar, and heard their secrets whispered in the golden halls of Olympus. But favor, as any student of Greek mythology knows, is a double-edged sword that cuts deepest when wielded by those who mistake divine friendship for divine equality. Tantalus, whose very name would become synonymous with torment, committed a crime so heinous that it reverberates through the ages. The exact nature of his transgression varies in the telling, each version more disturbing than the last. Some say he stole ambrosia and nectar from the gods' table, attempting to share divine sustenance with mortals. Others whisper that he revealed the secrets of Olympus to his earthly subjects, betraying the trust of immortals who had welcomed him as a friend. But the most chilling account speaks of a dinner party, a grotesque parody of hospitality that would make even the gods recoil in horror. Tantalus, in his twisted desire to test the omniscience of his divine guests, slaughtered his own son Pelops. He butchered the boy's body, cooked the flesh, and served it as a feast to the unsuspecting gods. It was an act of such profound sacrilege that it shattered the very foundations of Xenia, the sacred bond between host and guest that held ancient society together. The gods, being divine, immediately recognized the abomination placed before them. All refused to partake, save for Demeter, who, in her grief over her missing daughter, Persephone, absently consumed a portion of the child's shoulder. The horror of realization struck like thunder through the halls of Olympus. Zeus, in his terrible wrath, immediately restored Pelops to life, replacing the consumed flesh with ivory, and turned his attention to the architect of this unspeakable crime. For Tantalus, death would have been mercy. Instead, Zeus crafted a punishment that would echo through eternity, a torment so perfectly calibrated to the nature of his crime that it became the template for divine justice itself. Tantalus was cast into the depths of Tartarus, bound in a realm where the very elements of sustenance would forever mock his existence. Picture, if you will, a man standing chin-deep in a crystal-clear lake, its waters cool and inviting. Above him hang the most magnificent fruit trees, their branches heavy with apples, pears, and figs, so ripe they seem to glow with inner light. The man is eternally hungry, eternally thirsty, and eternal relief dangles just beyond his reach. When he bends to drink, the water recedes, sinking away from his parched lips like a retreating tide. When he reaches for the fruit, the branches spring upward, as if pulled by invisible strings, leaving him grasping at empty air. This is the curse of Tantalus, to be forever tantalized, forever on the precipice of satisfaction, yet never to know even a moment's respite from desire. The punishment fits the crime with cosmic precision. Just as he had perverted the act of hospitality, turning nourishment into horror, so too would he be forever denied the basic sustenance that makes life bearable. But the true genius of this curse lies not in its physical torment, but in its psychological architecture. Tantalus is not merely denied food and water, he is denied the very possibility of adaptation. A mortal might eventually accept his fate, might find peace in resignation, but Tantalus, granted immortality for his punishment, must forever believe that this time, perhaps this time, he might succeed. Hope itself becomes the instrument of his torture. The myth of Tantalus speaks to something fundamental in the human condition, the gap between desire and fulfillment, between what we want and what we can achieve, in making Tantalus's punishment eternal. The gods created a perfect metaphor for the human experience of longing. We are all, in our way, reaching for fruit that retreats from our grasp, seeking waters that recede when we need them most. Chapter 2. The boulder, the hill, and the futility of rebellion from the depths of Tartarus. Where Tantalus performs his eternal dance with desire, we move to another chamber of divine punishment, where the sound of stone against stone echoes through eternity. Here dwells Sisyphus, the king of Corinth, whose name has become synonymous with futile effort and endless struggle. Sisyphus was no ordinary mortal. He was clever, perhaps too clever, a master of cunning who believed his intelligence could outwit even the gods themselves. His hubris was not born of strength or beauty, but of the most dangerous kind of arrogance, the belief that mortal wit could triumph over divine will. The stories of Sisyphus's transgressions are as varied as they are disturbing. He was accused of hubris, of revealing divine secrets, of general deceit and trickery. But the most compelling account involves his greatest act of defiance, cheating death itself. When Thanatos, the personification of death, came to claim him, Sisyphus managed to trick the god into his own chains, effectively stopping death from claiming anyone in the world. Zeus, horrified by this disruption of natural order, was forced to intervene, freeing Thanatos and ensuring that Sisyphus would meet his fate. But even death could not contain the cunning of Sisyphus. Before dying, he instructed his wife to leave, his body unburied, a deliberate violation of sacred custom that would anger the gods of the underworld. When he arrived in Hades, he pleaded with Persephone to allow him to return to the world of the living, claiming he needed to properly chastise his wife for her disrespect of the dead. The queen of the underworld, moved by his apparent devotion to proper funeral rites, granted his request. Once returned to life, Sisyphus had no intention of keeping his word. He lived for many more years, enjoying the fruits of his deception, believing himself the cleverest of mortals. But the gods' memory is long, and their patience, while vast, is not infinite. When Sisyphus finally died a natural death, his punishment was waiting. The curse of Sisyphus is deceptively simple. He must roll a massive boulder up a steep hill for all eternity. Every time he nears the summit, the boulder rolls back down, and he must begin again. The physical torment is obvious, but the psychological dimension is what transforms this. Punishment from mere labor into exquisite torture. Imagine the weight of the stone, worn smooth by countless millennia of handling, pressing into flesh that can feel pain but cannot be destroyed. Feel the strain in muscles that can tire but never rest, the burning in lungs that can labor but never find relief. But worse than the physical agony is the knowledge that accompanies every step. This effort is meaningless. This struggle is endless. This task will never be completed. The curse of Sisyphus speaks to the absurdity of existence itself. In his eternal labor, we see reflected every human endeavor that seems to lead nowhere, every effort that must be repeated, every goal that, once achieved, only reveals another mountain to climb. His punishment is not just personal, it is archetypal, representing the human condition in all its futile glory. What makes Sisyphus's curse particularly cruel is its false promise of completion. Unlike Tantalus, who can never reach his goal, Sisyphus can see the summit, can feel victory within his grasp. For a moment, at the peak of each cycle, he experiences the illusion of success, only to watch it slip away and begin again. The curse feeds on hope, uses it as fuel for despair. Modern philosophers have found in Sisyphus a symbol of the human condition, a representation of our struggle to find meaning in an apparently meaningless universe. But the ancient Greeks saw something even more disturbing: the consequence of believing that cleverness alone could overcome divine authority. Sisyphus thought he could outsmart fate itself, and in doing so, he ensured that his fate would be to struggle forever against the very forces he sought to overcome. Chapter 3. The Gaze That Turned Love to Stone. In the pantheon of Greek curses, few are as visually striking or as tragic as the transformation of Medusa. Her story is one of beauty destroyed, innocence punished, and divine justice perverted into something unrecognizable. It is a tale that reveals the capricious nature of godly wrath and the terrible price of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Medusa was not born a monster. She was one of the Gorgon sisters, but unlike her siblings, Steno and Euryale, she was mortal, gifted with extraordinary beauty that caught the eye of gods and mortals alike. Her hair was said to flow like golden silk, her skin to glow with the radiance of youth, and her eyes to hold the depth of the sea itself. She served as a priestess in the temple of Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, dedicating her life to virginity and sacred service. But beauty, in the world of Greek mythology, is both blessing and curse. It draws attention, and attention from the gods is a dangerous thing. Poseidon, lord of the seas, brother to Zeus himself, looked upon Medusa with desire that burned like the heart of a whirlpool. He was not a god who accepted refusal gracefully, nor one who respected the sanctity of temples or the vows of priestesses. The violation occurred within Athena's own temple, on the very altar where Medusa had pledged her purity. Poseidon, god of earthquakes and storms, took what he wanted with the casual cruelty of a tsunami claiming a coastal village. The temple shook, the sacred flames flickered, and when the violence was done, Medusa lay broken on the marble floor, her vows shattered, her innocence stolen, her life irrevocably changed. But the most horrifying aspect of this tale is not the crime itself, but the response of the goddess whose temple had been defiled. Athena, patron of justice and wisdom, did not turn her wrath upon her rapist brother. Instead, she turned it upon the victim. In the twisted logic of divine justice, Medusa's violation was somehow her fault. Her presence in the temple a provocation, her beauty a weapon turned against the gods themselves. The curse that Athena placed upon Medusa was as creative as it was cruel. The beautiful hair that had caught Poseidon's eye was transformed into a writhing mass of venomous serpents, each one alive with malice and hunger. Her lovely face became a mask of horror, with bronze scales, boar-like tusks, and eyes that glowed with supernatural malevolence. But the most terrible aspect of the curse was not how she looked, but what she could do. Anyone who gazed directly upon Medusa's face would be instantly transformed into stone. Not killed, but petrified, their consciousness trapped forever in a marble prison. Aware, but unable to move, speak, or die. The curse ensured that Medusa would never again know human companionship, never feel the touch of another person, never experience love or even simple kindness. She became the ultimate embodiment of isolation. A creature so dangerous that even sympathy required maintaining a deadly distance. The irony of Medusa's curse is breathtaking in its cruelty. She had been punished for her beauty, but now that beauty had become a weapon she could not control. The eyes that had once gazed with love and devotion now brought death to any who looked into them. The face that had inspired admiration now inspired terror. The woman who had served the goddess of wisdom was transformed into a monster who could only bring mindless destruction. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Medusa's story is what it reveals about the nature of divine justice in the ancient world. The gods were not paragons of morality. They were beings of immense power whose actions often reflected the worst aspects of human nature magnified to cosmic proportions. Athena's punishment of Medusa was not justice. It was projection, a way of displacing her anger at Poseidon onto a victim who could not retaliate. The curse of Medusa speaks to the experience of trauma, of how violation can transform the victim into something unrecognizable, something that others fear to approach. In transforming Medusa into a monster, Athena ensured that she would never again be seen as a victim deserving of compassion, but as a threat to be eliminated. The curse was not just physical, it was social, psychological, and spiritual, cutting Medusa off from everything that made life meaningful. When Perseus finally came to claim Medusa's head, he did not see a victim of divine injustice. He saw a monster to be slain. The curse had achieved its ultimate goal. It had erased Medusa's humanity, so completely that her death was celebrated as a heroic deed, rather than mourned as a tragedy. Even in death, she remained cursed, her head used as a weapon, her gaze still turning enemies to stone. Chapter 4. The Prophet Who Spoke Truth to Deaf Ears. In the grand theatre of Greek mythology, few figures embody the tragic irony of divine favor quite like Cassandra, the Trojan princess whose gift became her torment, whose truth became her prison, and whose prophecies became her curse. Her story is one of the most psychologically complex curses in the ancient world. A punishment that turned the highest of human gifts into the deepest of human hells. Cassandra was blessed with extraordinary beauty, but beauty was common enough among the daughters of kings. What set her apart was her spiritual sensitivity, her ability to perceive the hidden currents of fate that flowed beneath the surface of mortal events. It was this sensitivity that caught the attention of Apollo, god of prophecy, music, and light, who saw in her a worthy vessel for his divine gift. The god of prophecy was not content merely to admire Cassandra from afar. He courted her with the persistence of a lover and the authority of a deity, offering her a gift that mortals could only dream of, the ability to see the future with perfect clarity. True prophecy was not a common gift, even among the most skilled seers. Most oracles spoke in riddles, their visions clouded by mystery and metaphor. But Apollo offered Cassandra something unprecedented, the power to see future events as clearly as if they were unfolding before her eyes. The gift came with conditions, as divine gifts always do. Apollo expected Cassandra to become his lover, to offer her body as payment for the divine power flowing through her mind. But Cassandra, perhaps already seeing glimpses of the future that awaited her, refused. She accepted the gift, but rejected. The giver, keeping the power of prophecy while denying Apollo the physical union he desired. The god of light was not accustomed to rejection. His divine pride, wounded by mortal defiance, demanded satisfaction. But Apollo faced a problem. A gift freely given could not be taken back, even by the god who had bestowed it. The power of prophecy was now part of Cassandra's essence, woven into her very being. Apollo could not retrieve his gift, but he could corrupt it, twist it, turn it into something that would punish her for her defiance. The curse Apollo placed upon Cassandra was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. She would retain her perfect ability to see the future, but no one would ever believe her prophecies. Every vision would be true, every warning accurate, every prediction fulfilled, but her words would fall on deaf ears. She would become a prophet without authority, a seer without influence, a voice crying out in a wilderness of disbelief. Imagine the torment of knowing with absolute certainty that disaster is approaching, that loved ones are walking toward destruction, that an entire city is about to fall, and being unable to convince anyone to change course. Cassandra could see the Trojan horse for what it was, could perceive the Greeks hidden in its hollow belly, could foresee the fall of Troy with perfect clarity. But when she warned her fellow Trojans, they dismissed her as mad, her prophecies as the ravings of a disturbed mind. The curse of Cassandra transforms knowledge from a blessing into a burden. She became a living embodiment of the phrase, "I told you so," but without the satisfaction of vindication. Even when her prophecies came true, people did not remember her warnings or acknowledge her accuracy. The curse seemed to erase memory itself, ensuring that her credibility could never be established, her reputation never redeemed. The psychological dimensions of this curse are particularly cruel. Cassandra was not denied the ability to speak. She was denied the ability to be heard. She was not robbed of knowledge. She was robbed of the capacity to act on that knowledge. The curse created a kind of living death, a state of perpetual frustration where the most important truths became impossible to communicate. What makes Cassandra's curse especially tragic is its self-reinforcing nature. The more desperately she tried to warn people, the more frantic she appeared, the more accurate her predictions, the more convinced people became that she was insane. The curse fed on itself, using her very attempts to help as proof of her unreliability. She became trapped in a cycle where the truth itself became evidence of her madness. The story of Cassandra speaks to the experience of anyone who has tried to warn others of dangers they refuse to see, of anyone who has possessed unpopular knowledge, of anyone who has spoken inconvenient truths to those who prefer comfortable lies. Her curse is not merely mythological, it is archetypal, representing the isolation that comes with seeing clearly in a world that prefers blindness. In the end, Cassandra's curse outlived even the fall of Troy. When the city finally fell, just as she had predicted, she was taken as a prize by Agamemnon, who brought her back to Mycenae as his concubine. But even in captivity, the curse continued to operate. She prophesied Agamemnon's death at the hands of his wife Clytemnestra, and her own death alongside him. As always, her words were dismissed, and as always, her prophecies came true. Both she and Agamemnon were murdered, their deaths unfolding exactly as she had foreseen, her final prophecy validated by her own blood. Chapter 5. The Bloodline Cursed by Fate. In the vast catalogue of Greek curses, Few are as comprehensive or as generationally devastating as the curse that fell upon the house of Oedipus. This is not merely the story of one man's tragic fate, but of an entire bloodline doomed to repeat patterns of violence, incest, and self-destruction across multiple generations. It is a curse that operates through the very fabric of destiny itself, using fate as its weapon and prophecy as its ammunition. The curse began with Laius, king of Thebes, whose crime was not one of hubris or defiance, but of violence and violation. During his youth, while in exile, Laius had raped Chrysippus, the young son of King Pelops. The boy, consumed by shame and despair, took his own life. Pelops, in his grief and rage, called down a curse upon Laius that would echo through the generations. The king would never know the love of a legitimate son, and if he ever fathered a child, that child would kill him. When Laius returned to Thebes and married Jocasta, the curse seemed to lie dormant. The royal couple lived childless for years, the king perhaps believing that his restraint had outwitted fate itself. But the gods are patient, and curses, once spoken, have a way of finding their mark. Eventually, Jocasta conceived, and when their son was born, the oracle at Delphi confirmed Pelops's curse. The child would grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. The response of Laius to this prophecy reveals the terrible irony that runs through all Greek tragedy. The very actions taken to avoid fate often become the means by which fate is fulfilled. Determined to prevent the prophecy from coming true, Laius ordered the infant's feet to be pinned together and the child to be abandoned on Mount Cithaeron to die. The name given to the child Oedipus means swollen foot, a permanent reminder of his father's attempt to murder him, but the curse was not so easily defeated. The shepherd, charged with abandoning the infant, took pity on the child and gave him to a herdsman from Corinth. The baby was eventually adopted by King Polybus and Queen Merope, who raised him as their own son. Oedipus grew up believing himself to be their biological child, unaware of his true parentage or the prophecy that hung over his head like a sword of Damocles. The curse waited patiently for its moment. When Oedipus reached adulthood, he learned of a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified by this prediction, and believing it referred to his adoptive parents, he fled Corinth, determined to escape his fate. But in fleeing from his supposed destiny, he ran directly toward his actual one, on the road to Thebes. At a crossroads that would become symbolic of choice and fate, Oedipus encountered a group of travelers. A dispute arose over who had the right of way, and in the ensuing conflict, Oedipus killed several men, including their leader. He did not know that the man he had killed was Laius, his biological father. The first part of the prophecy had been fulfilled, not through deliberate parricide, but through a moment of road rage that seemed utterly random. Arriving in Thebes, Oedipus found the city terrorized by the Sphinx, a monster that posed riddles to travelers and devoured those who answered incorrectly. The creature's riddle was famous. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus, whose name meant swollen foot, ironically provided the answer. Man, who crawls as a baby, walks upright as an adult, and uses a cane in old age. The Sphinx, defeated by his correct answer, threw herself from a cliff. Thebes, grateful for their deliverance, made Oedipus their king and gave him the hand of the recently widowed queen, Jocasta. Neither knew that they were mother and son. Neither realized that the second part of the prophecy was now complete. They lived together as husband and wife, ruling Thebes and producing 4 children: Antigone, Ismen, Eteocles, and Polynices. The curse might have remained hidden forever, but curses, like truth, have a way of revealing themselves. A plague fell upon Thebes, and the oracle declared that it would not lift until the murderer of Laius was found and punished. Oedipus, as the conscientious king, launched an investigation into the death of his predecessor, not knowing that he was hunting himself. The investigation that followed is one of the most psychologically complex narratives in all of literature. Oedipus, the great solver of riddles, slowly unraveled the mystery of his own identity. Each clue he uncovered brought him closer to a truth that would destroy everything he thought he knew about himself. The shepherd who had saved him as an infant was brought forward. The messenger who had delivered him to Corinth was questioned. The terrible facts began to emerge. The moment of recognition, when Oedipus finally understood the full scope of his fate, is one of the most powerful scenes in Greek tragedy. He had not merely committed murder and incest. He had fulfilled a prophecy that had been spoken before his birth, had walked a path that had been laid out for him by forces beyond his control. The curse had not merely punished him, it had orchestrated his entire life, turning his greatest virtues into the instruments of his destruction. Jocasta, realizing the truth, hanged herself in despair. Oedipus, finding her body, used the golden pins from her dress to blind himself. Unable to bear seeing the world that had deceived him so completely, he who had been the greatest of seers, the solver of the Sphinx's riddle, chose to become literally blind, as if physical blindness might somehow grant him relief from the terrible clarity of his insight. But the curse of the house of Oedipus did not end with his self-imposed exile. It passed to his children, each of whom would be destroyed by the legacy of their father's fate. Eteocles and Polynices would kill each other in a civil war over the throne of Thebes. Antigone would be executed for defying the state's order not to bury her brother. Ismen would be the only one to survive, but she would live with the knowledge that her entire family had been consumed by forces beyond their control. The curse of Oedipus represents the ultimate expression of fatalism in Greek thought. It suggests that some destinies are so powerful that they cannot be escaped, that the very attempts to avoid fate become the means by which fate is fulfilled. The curse operates not through direct divine intervention, but through the complex interplay of character, circumstance, and chance that shapes human existence. Chapter 6. The King Who Denied the God of Wine. In the shadowed valleys of ancient Thrace, where the mountains touched the sky and the forests whispered secrets older than memory, there ruled a king named Pentheus, whose story would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of denying the gods their due. His curse is unique in the pantheon of Greek punishments, for it was not merely a personal torment, but a collective madness that transformed an entire city into an instrument of divine vengeance. Pentheus was the young king of Thebes, grandson of Cadmus, the city's founder, and cousin to the god Dionysus himself. This familial connection, which should have provided him with protection and divine favor, instead became the source of his doom. For Pentheus represented everything that Dionysus stood against: rigid order, rational thought, and the denial of ecstatic experience. When Dionysus arrived in Thebes, he came not as a conquering god, but as a liberator, offering the people release from the constraints of civilized life. His followers, the Maenads, were women who had abandoned their domestic roles to dance in the mountains, to drink wine, and to experience the divine madness that comes from union with the god. They tore through the forests with their hair unbound, their clothes disheveled, their eyes wild with sacred frenzy. to Pentheus. This was not religious worship, but dangerous anarchy. He saw, in the Dionysiac mysteries, a threat to the social order he was sworn to protect. The sight of respectable women abandoning their homes to follow a foreign god filled him with horror and rage. He refused to acknowledge Dionysus as divine, dismissing him as a charlatan who used drugs and trickery to seduce the weak, dash-minded. The confrontation between Pentheus and Dionysus is one of the most psychologically complex in all of Greek mythology. Dionysus, disguised as a mortal priest, allowed himself to be captured and brought before the king. The god offered Pentheus multiple opportunities to recognize him, to accept his divinity, to join in the sacred mysteries. But Pentheus, blinded by his own rationality, could not see the divine nature of the being before him. The curse that Dionysus placed upon Pentheus was not immediate death, but something far more insidious: the gradual erosion of his sanity and the transformation of his own family into instruments of his destruction. The god began by sending a divine madness upon the women of Thebes, including Pentheus's mother, Agave, and his aunts Ino and Ata. These women, who had denied that their sister Semele had been loved by Zeus and had given birth to a god, were driven from their homes to join the Maenads. In the mountains, the curse operated through the very bonds of family that should have protected. Pentheus, his mother and aunts, consumed by Dionysiac frenzy, no longer recognized him as their son and nephew. In their madness, they saw him as a wild boar, a dangerous beast that threatened their sacred revels. The curse had not merely driven them insane. It had transformed their perception of reality itself, making them see their beloved king as a monster to be destroyed. Pentheus, desperate to understand what was happening to his city, disguised himself as a woman and went to spy on the Maenads. This decision, born of his need to maintain control, became the final step in his doom. The god who had offered him the chance to witness the mysteries as a willing participant now forced him to observe them as a doomed voyeur. The discovery of Pentheus by the Maenads unleashed a violence that was both random and ritualistic. In their divine madness, they fell upon him with superhuman strength, tearing him apart with their bare hands. The curse reached its climax when Agave, still possessed by the god's influence, ripped off her son's head and carried it triumphantly back to Thebes, believing it to be the head of a wild boar she had killed. The moment of recognition, when Agave finally understood what she had done, is one of the most heartbreaking scenes in all of Greek tragedy. The curse had not merely killed Pentheus, it had forced his own mother to be the instrument of his destruction. When the madness lifted and she saw her son's head in her hands, the full horror of the god's vengeance was revealed. She had not merely lost her son, she had killed him with her own hands, had carried his severed head through the streets in triumph. The curse of Pentheus reveals the dangerous seductiveness of divine power. Dionysus did not simply punish the king for his defiance. He made the punishment into a religious experience, a sacred drama in which the entire city participated. The Maenads were not merely instruments of vengeance. They were worshippers caught up in divine ecstasy, their violence sanctified by their religious fervor. What makes this curse particularly disturbing is its use of family bonds as weapons. Pentheus was not destroyed by strangers or enemies, but by the women who loved him most. The curse turned maternal love into matricidal rage, transformed protective instincts into destructive fury. In making Agave the instrument of her son's death, Dionysus created a punishment that was both personal and cosmic, both intimate and universal. The story of Pentheus serves as a warning about the dangers of denying the irrational aspects of human nature, his curse was not merely divine punishment, but a manifestation of the forces that exist beyond the realm of reason and control. In trying to deny Dionysus, Pentheus was trying to deny a fundamental aspect of human experience, and the god's vengeance was a brutal reminder that such denial comes at a terrible cost. Chapter 7. The hunter who became the hunted. In the primordial forests of ancient Greece, where sunlight filtered through ancient oak and pine, where streams ran clear and cold from mountain springs, there lived a hunter whose skills were legendary even among the gods. Actaeon, grandson of Cadmus and trained by the centaur Chiron himself, was the epitome of mortal excellence in the hunt. His story would become one of the most viscerally terrifying transformations in Greek mythology, a curse that turned predator into prey in the most literal and horrifying way possible. Actaeon's curse was born not from hubris or defiance, but from the simple misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. On a day that began like any other, he was hunting in the forests of Boeotia with his faithful pack of hounds. 50 dogs whose loyalty to their master was absolute. The hunt had been successful, and as the midday sun climbed high, Actaeon decided to rest in a secluded glen, allowing his dogs to drink from a crystal-clear stream. What Actaeon did not know was that this stream was sacred to Artemis, the Virgin, goddess of the hunt, and that at that very moment she had chosen this spot for her own bathing. The goddess of the moon and the chase valued her privacy above all else, and the punishment for seeing her naked was death. There were no exceptions, no consideration for intent or accident. The divine body was sacred, and mortal eyes that looked upon it would be closed forever. The moment of discovery was electric with divine fury. Artemis, caught in her vulnerability, her immortal body exposed to mortal gaze, felt a rage that shook the very foundations of the forest. But she was weaponless. Her silver bow set aside for bathing, her arrows beyond reach. She could not strike down the intruder immediately, but she could ensure that his death would be both creative and terrible. Seizing a handful of water from the stream, Artemis flung it at Actaeon's face, and with it she spoke the words that would transform him. Now you may tell that you have seen the goddess of the hunt naked, if you can tell it. The curse was already working as she spoke, the water burning like acid where it touched his skin, beginning a transformation that would strip away everything that made him human. The change began with his head. Actaeon felt his skull elongating, his jaw extending, his teeth reshaping themselves into the flat, grinding surfaces of a herbivore. Antlers, magnificent and many-pointed, burst from his forehead with such force that he could feel them tearing through flesh and bone. His skin became coarse and brown, covered with the short, bristly hair of a stag. His hands transformed into hooves, his spine bent and stretched, his entire body remade in the image of the creature he had so often hunted. But the most cruel aspect of the curse was what had left unchanged: his mind. Actaeon retained his human consciousness, his memories, his awareness of what was happening to him. He could think and feel and understand his situation, but he could not speak, could not explain, could not cry out for help. The curse had made him a mute witness to his own destruction, trapped in a body that was no longer his own. The transformation was complete in moments, but those moments stretched like hours in Actaeon's perception. He saw his own hands become hooves, felt his voice become a bestial grunt, watched his faithful dogs look up at him with sudden, predatory interest. The animals that had been his companions, his partners in the hunt, now saw him as prey. The curse had not merely changed his body, it had severed the bonds of loyalty and love that connected him to his own hounds. What followed was a chase that inverted everything Actaeon had known about hunting. He who had been the master of the forest became its victim, running through familiar paths that now seemed alien and hostile. Every root and stone that had once aided his pursuit now became an obstacle to his escape. The woods that had been his kingdom became his prison, and the knowledge that had made him a great hunter now served only to show him how hopeless his situation truly was. His dogs, led by Melanius and Icnobates, pursued him with the same dedication they had once shown in serving him. They could not recognize their master in this strange stag, and even if they could have, the divine curse had awakened something primal in them, a hunger that overrode all other instincts. The pack spread out through the forest, using the very techniques Actaeon had taught them, surrounding him, cutting off his escape routes, driving him toward the inevitable conclusion. The chase lasted for hours, a prolonged agony that took Actaeon through every corner of his former domain. He ran past the clearings where he had made his first successful kills, through the streams where he had watered his dogs, over the hills where he had taught young hunters the arts of tracking and stealth. Each familiar landmark became a station of his suffering, a reminder of the life that had been taken from him. When the dogs finally cornered him, Actaeon tried desperately to make them understand who he was. He lowered his great antlered head, trying to assume the submissive posture he had seen in other stags, hoping that some spark of recognition might save him. But the curse had made such recognition impossible. To his dogs, he was simply another stag, another quarry to be brought down and torn apart. The kill was swift, but not merciful. The dogs fell upon him with the efficiency he had trained into, their teeth finding the vital spots with practiced precision. As his life flowed out onto the forest floor, Actaeon's last sight was of his own faithful hounds, their muzzles red with his blood, their eyes bright with the satisfaction of a successful hunt. The curse had transformed his greatest achievement into the instrument of his death. The story of Actaeon speaks to the fragility of human identity and the thin line between civilization and savagery. His curse was not merely physical transformation, but a complete inversion of his place in the natural order. The hunter became the hunted, the master became the victim, the beloved became the despised. In a single moment, everything that defined him was stripped away, leaving only the essential vulnerability that lies at the heart of all mortal existence. Chapter 8. The Mother Who Became Stone. In the ancient city of Thebes, where the stones themselves seemed to hold memories of divine visitation, there lived a woman whose pride would transform her into the most tragic figure in the catalogue of maternal loss. Niobe, daughter of Tantalus and queen of Thebes, possessed everything that mortal women desired: beauty, wealth, a loving husband, and most precious of all, 14 children who were the light of her life and the crown of her happiness. Niobe's curse began with a comparison, as so many Greek tragedies do. During a festival honoring Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, Niobe made a boast that would echo through the ages in its arrogance and its consequences. She stood before the assembled women of Thebes and declared that she was more blessed than the goddess herself. After all, she reasoned, what had Leto accomplished? She had given birth to merely 2 children, while Niobe had 14, 7 sons and 7 daughters, each one perfect in form and accomplishment. The comparison was more than mere pride. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of divine blessing. Niobe measured worth in numbers, in quantity rather than quality. Not understanding that Leto's 2 children were gods, immortal beings whose power and importance transcended any mortal achievement. Her boast was not merely factually wrong, it was spiritually blind, revealing a heart that could not distinguish between the temporary and the eternal. The words had barely left Niobe's lips when they reached the ears of Apollo and Artemis, who were visiting their mother on the island of Delos, the twin gods, whose love for their mother was as fierce as their divine power, heard the insult and felt their immortal blood burn with rage. No mortal could disparage Leto and live, especially not one who dared to claim superiority over the goddess who had given birth to the sun and moon themselves. The curse that fell upon Niobe was not a transformation or an eternal punishment, but something far more immediate and devastating: the systematic destruction of everything she held dear. Apollo and Artemis, armed with their silver bows and arrows that never missed their mark, descended upon Thebes like avenging angels of death. The slaughter began with Niobe's 7 sons, who were engaged in athletic competitions in the fields. Outside the city, Apollo, god of archery and the sun, struck them down one by one with arrows that flew like rays of light. Each shot was perfect, each death instantaneous, each loss a dagger in Niobe's heart. The young men, who had been laughing and competing just moments before, fell to the earth like wheat before the scythe. But the gods were not finished. Artemis, goddess of the hunt and protector of young maidens, turned her bow upon Niobe's 7 daughters. The girls, who had been weaving in their mother's chamber, died where they sat, their threads still in their hands, their songs still on their lips. The curse struck without warning, without mercy, without the possibility of escape or appeal. In the space of a single day, Niobe went from being the most blessed of mothers to the most bereaved. 14 children, the pride of her heart and the foundation of her identity, lay dead around her. The palace that had echoed with laughter and music became a tomb, silent except for the sound of Niobe's grief. The curse of Niobe was not merely the loss of her children, but the manner of that loss. She was forced to watch as each child died, to see the light leave their eyes, to witness the destruction of her entire future. The gods had not simply killed her children, they had made her a witness to divine justice, a living example of what happened when mortals dared to compare themselves favorably to the immortals. For 9 days and 9 nights, Niobe sat among the bodies of her children, refusing to eat, refusing to drink, refusing to allow them to be buried. Her grief was so profound that it transcended human emotion and became something elemental, a force of nature that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. She wept until there were no more tears to shed, mourned until her voice was gone, grieved until grief itself became her entire existence. On the 10th day, the gods themselves, moved by pity or perhaps simply exhausted by the spectacle of such profound sorrow, buried Niobe's children. But even this act of divine mercy could not restore the queen to life. Her grief had become so total, so consuming, that it had transformed her essential nature. She was no longer a woman who grieved. She was grief itself, made manifest in human form. The final transformation came as a kind of mercy. Niobe, her heart turned to stone by the weight of her loss, began to petrify from within. Her flesh became marble, her hair became flowing stone. Her tears became eternal streams that would flow forever down the face of the cliff. The curse had not killed her. It had preserved her in her moment of ultimate sorrow, creating a monument to maternal grief that would endure for all time. The stone figure of Niobe was said to weep constantly, her tears visible even to travelers who passed by centuries later. She had become the ultimate symbol of loss, a reminder that no mortal joy is permanent, no blessing secure from the caprice of fate. Her curse was not merely personal punishment, but a universal statement about the nature of mortal existence, and the price of challenging the gods in transforming Niobe into stone. The gods had created something more powerful than any living woman, a symbol that would speak to grieving mothers for all eternity. Her curse became a kind of immortality, ensuring that her story would be told and retold, that her grief would resonate through the ages, that her loss would give meaning to the losses of others. Chapter 9. The nymph who lost her voice in the verdant forests of ancient Greece, where every stream had its naiad, and every tree its dryad. There lived a mountain nymph whose voice was legendary among gods and mortals alike. Echo possessed the gift of eloquence, a silver tongue that could charm birds from the trees and make even the stones weep with the beauty of her words. Her curse would transform this greatest of gifts into a prison of repetition, a punishment that would make her voice itself the instrument of her torment. Echo's downfall began with her loyalty to Zeus, the king of the gods, whose wandering eye was as well known as his thunderbolts. When Zeus engaged in his numerous affairs with mortals and immortals alike, Echo would serve as his accomplice, using her gift of speech to distract his wife Hera with endless, captivating stories, while Echo wove her verbal spells, holding the goddess's attention with tales of wonder and adventure. Zeus would slip away to pursue his latest obsession. The deception worked for a time, but Hera was not called the Queen of Heaven for nothing. Her intelligence was as sharp as her jealousy, and eventually she began to suspect that Echo's perfectly timed appearances and unusually lengthy conversations were not mere coincidence. The goddess of marriage and family, already tormented by her husband's infidelities, felt her rage double when she realized that she had been made a fool of by a mere nymph. The curse that Hera placed upon Echo was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its completeness. Echo would retain her voice, but she would lose the ability to speak first or to express her own thoughts. From that moment forward, she could only repeat the final words spoken by others, condemned to be an eternal follower in conversations, never again to lead or initiate. The nymph who had once held audiences spellbound with her original tales would become nothing more than a vocal shadow, reflecting the words of others without ever again speaking her own. The immediate effects of the curse were socially catastrophic. Echo, who had been the center of every gathering, the spark of every conversation, suddenly found herself unable to participate in the basic exchanges of social life. She could not greet friends, could not ask questions, could not express opinions or emotions. Her voice, which had once been her greatest asset, became a constant reminder of her punishment, useful only for mimicking the speech of others. But the true cruelty of Echo's curse became apparent when she encountered Narcissus, the beautiful youth who would become the object of her hopeless love. Narcissus possessed a beauty so perfect that it seemed almost divine, but his heart was as cold as his face was fair. He had rejected every suitor who had ever approached him, both male and female, showing no interest in love or companionship. When Echo first saw Narcissus hunting in the forest, she was struck by a passion more powerful than any she had ever experienced. Here was a being whose beauty matched her own lost eloquence, whose perfection seemed to call out for the kind of verbal artistry she had once possessed. She longed to approach him, to speak to him, to win his love with the silver tongue that had once been her glory. But the curse made such courtship impossible. Echo could not call out to Narcissus as he passed, could not introduce herself, could not begin the delicate dance of seduction that might have won his heart. She could only follow him through the forest, hoping for an opportunity to respond to his words, to make some connection, however limited. That the opportunity came when Narcissus, separated from his hunting companions, called out into the forest, "Is anyone there?" Echo, her heart racing with hope, could only respond with the final words, "Anyone there?" The conversation that followed was both tragic and absurd, a courtship conducted through repetition, where every attempt at connection was undermined by the very nature of the curse. When Narcissus finally said, "Come to me," Echo emerged from the forest, her arms outstretched, her face radiant with love and hope. But Narcissus, seeing her approach, recoiled in disgust. "Away with these embraces," he cried. "I would rather die than give you power over me." Echo, crushed by his rejection, could only repeat his final words, "Give you power over me." The irony was complete. She who had no power even over her own voice was accused of seeking power over another. The rejection shattered Echo's spirit. Completely, she fled to the mountains, where she wasted away from unrequited love, her body growing thin and insubstantial until only her voice remained. The curse had not merely taken away her ability to speak, it had taken away her ability to love successfully, to connect with others, to find meaning in existence. In her final form, Echo became a disembodied voice, haunting caves and mountains, able only to repeat the words of others for all eternity. She had become the literal embodiment of her curse, a sound without substance, a voice without a body, a consciousness trapped in the prison of repetition. The story of Echo's curse speaks to the power of communication and the tragedy of its loss. Her punishment was not merely personal, but social, cutting her off from the very thing that defines human existence, the ability to express oneself, to share thoughts and feelings, to participate in the great conversation of life. In making her voice dependent on others, the curse had made her existence itself dependent on the speech of those around her. The curse of Echo also reveals the cruel precision of divine justice. Hera had not simply taken away Echo's voice, she had perverted it, turning the nymph's greatest gift into a constant reminder of her punishment. Every word Echo spoke was an echo of someone else's thought. Every conversation a reminder of her inability to contribute anything original to the world. Chapter 10. The House Built on Blood. In the blood-soaked annals of Greek mythology, no family line carries a curse more comprehensive or more horrifying than the House of Atreus. This is not merely the story of individual punishment, but of a generational curse that would consume multiple dynasties, turning fathers against sons, brothers against brothers, and wives against husbands in an endless cycle of revenge and retribution that would span centuries. The curse of the Atreides began with Tantalus, whose punishment we have already witnessed in the depths of Tartarus. But his crime against the gods was only the first note in a symphony of horror that would crescendo through the generations. Tantalus's son, Pelops, would add his own dark verse to the family's cursed legacy, and from him the curse would pass to his sons, Atreus and Thyestes, who would transform it into something even more monstrous. The brothers, Atreus and Thyestes, were locked in a rivalry that went far beyond normal sibling competition. They fought over the throne of Mycenae, over the golden fleece of Zeus, and most fatally, over Erep, the wife of Atreus. When Thyestes seduced his brother's wife and stole the golden fleece, that symbolized the right to rule. Atreus felt a rage that transcended ordinary anger and entered the realm of divine fury. The revenge that Atreus planned was not merely cruel. It was a deliberate echo of his grandfather Tantalus's crime, a repetition of the family's original sin with variations that made it even more horrifying. Atreus pretended to reconcile with his brother, inviting Thyestes to a feast of reconciliation. But the meal that Atreus prepared was a banquet of horrors that would make even the gods recoil. Atreus murdered Thyestes' 3 young sons, butchered their bodies, and served their flesh to their father as the main course of the feast. The curse that had begun with Tantalus serving his own son to the gods had now become a tradition of cannibalistic revenge, passed down through the generations like a twisted family heirloom. When Thyestes had eaten his fill, Atreus revealed the truth, showing him the heads and hands of his children, the parts that had been too recognizable to serve. The horror of this revelation drove Thyestes to madness, but it also gave him the strength to call down a curse that would eclipse even the original punishment of Tantalus. He cursed the entire line of Atreus, calling upon the gods to ensure that no descendant of his brother would ever know peace, that violence would beget violence, that the family would devour itself generation after generation until nothing remained but blood and sorrow. The curse found its next expression in the generation of Agamemnon and Menelaus, the sons of Atreus. These brothers would become the leaders of the Greek expedition to Troy, but their glory would be tainted by the family curse that flowed in their veins. Agamemnon, the high king of Mycenae, would sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia to ensure favorable winds for the journey to Troy, continuing the family tradition of children dying for their parents' ambitions. The sacrifice of Iphigenia was not merely a military necessity. It was the curse working through the generations, demanding its tribute of young blood. Agamemnon, standing on the beach at Aulis with his daughter bound on the altar, was not simply a general making a hard choice. He was the latest link in a chain of violence that stretched back to Tantalus's original crime. But the curse was not finished with Agamemnon. While he was fighting at Troy, his wife Clytemnestra nursed her grief for their murdered daughter, letting it grow and fester until it became a cancer that consumed her capacity for forgiveness. When Agamemnon returned home in triumph, carrying with him Cassandra as his concubine, Clytemnestra was waiting with her lover Aegisthus, who was himself the son of Thyestes, carrying his own hereditary hatred for the house of Atreus. The murder of Agamemnon was choreographed with the precision of a religious ritual. Clytemnestra, pretending to welcome her husband home, helped him into a bath and then threw a net over him, trapping him like a beast marked for sacrifice. She and Aegisthus then hacked him to death with axes, his blood mingling with the bathwater, in a crimson pool that seemed to reflect the entire bloody history of his family. But even this act of vengeance could not end the curse. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, driven by duty and the demands of the family honor, would return to avenge his father's death. The curse had now created a situation where justice itself had become impossible. Orestes could not allow his father's murder to go unpunished, but in killing his mother, he would be committing matricide, a crime that would bring down upon him the fury of the Erinyes, the ancient goddesses of vengeance. The curse of the house of Atreus represents the ultimate expression of the Greek concept of inherited guilt. It suggests that some crimes are so profound that they cannot be contained within a single generation, that the sins of the fathers must be visited upon their children and their children's children until the debt is paid in full. The curse operated not through direct divine intervention, but through the psychology of violence, the way that cruelty begets cruelty, that revenge creates the need for more revenge. What makes this curse particularly terrifying is its self-perpetuating nature. Each act of violence was both a consequence of previous crimes and a cause of future ones. The curse had created a kind of moral perpetual motion machine, where the very attempts to achieve justice only created new injustices that demanded their own resolution. The house of Atreus became a symbol of the tragic nature of human existence, where the desire for justice and the need for revenge become indistinguishable, where the attempt to restore moral order only creates new forms of disorder. The curse had not merely punished the family, it had trapped them in a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. A demonstration of how the sins of one generation can poison the wells of justice for all who come after. Chapter 11. The eternal futility of the Danaids. In the burning sands of Egypt, where the Nile carved its green path through an endless desert, there lived a king named Danaus, whose 50 daughters would become the subjects of one of the most psychologically complex curses in Greek mythology. The curse of the Danaids represents not merely punishment for a crime, but a meditation on the nature of futility itself, a demonstration of how the gods could transform even the most basic human actions into instruments of eternal torment. The story begins with a conflict between brothers, as so many Greek tragedies do. Danas and his twin brother Aegisthus were locked in a rivalry that had consumed their lives and poisoned their relationship. When Aegisthus proposed to end their feud by marrying his 50 sons to Danas's 50 daughters, the offer seemed like a reasonable solution to their conflict. But Danas, guided by oracles and omens, saw in this proposal not reconciliation but a trap that would lead to his own death. Fearing that his brother's sons would murder him after the wedding, Danaus fled Egypt with his daughters, sailing across the Mediterranean to the ancient city of Argos. But Aegisthus was not so easily discouraged. He sent his 50 sons in pursuit, and when they caught up with Danos, they demanded the marriages proceed as planned. Faced with the threat of violence, Danaus agreed, but in his heart, he was already planning a revenge that would dwarf any crime his brother might have contemplated. On the wedding night, Danas gave each of his daughters a sharp dagger and a command that would echo through eternity. They were to kill their husbands in their beds, to transform their marriage chambers into slaughterhouses, to baptize their union with blood. It was a plan that perverted the most sacred of human institutions, turning the night of love into a night of murder. 40-9 of the 50 daughters obeyed their father's command without hesitation. As their new husbands lay sleeping, exhausted by the celebrations and perhaps by the consummation of their marriages, the Danaids struck. The daggers rose and fell in 49 different chambers, and by morning 49 young men lay dead, their blood staining the marriage beds that should have been the foundation of new life. But one daughter, Hypermnestra, could not bring herself to commit murder. Looking upon her husband Lynceus as he slept, she saw not an enemy but a young man who had shown her kindness, who had treated her with respect, who had done nothing to deserve death. Her love for him, or perhaps simply her human decency, proved stronger than her fear of her father. She warned Lynceus of the danger, and he fled into the night, the only son of Aegisthus to survive the massacre. The crime of the Danaids was not merely murder, it was a violation of the sacred laws of hospitality, marriage, and family. They had turned the marriage bed into a battlefield, had used their bodies as weapons. had perverted the very institution that was meant to create new life into an instrument of death. The gods could not allow such a crime to go unpunished, but the punishment they devised was more creative than simple death. In the underworld, the 49 guilty Danaids were condemned to an eternal task that would mock their crime with cosmic precision. They were given large jars and ordered to fill them with water from the river Styx, the boundary between life and death. The task seemed simple enough, but the jars had been constructed with holes in their bottoms, ensuring that no matter how much water was poured into them, they would never be filled. The curse of the Danaids was not merely the futility of their task, but the hope that accompanied it. Each day, they would begin their work with the belief that perhaps this time would be different, that perhaps they could overcome the flaw in their vessels through sheer determination or cleverness. They would carry water from the river, pour it into their jars, and watch it drain away, only to begin again with the same hopeless optimism. The psychological dimensions of this curse are particularly cruel. The Danaids were not simply condemned to meaningless labor. They were condemned to labor that had the appearance of purpose. They could see their goal, could understand what they were trying to accomplish, could even take pride in their technique and efficiency. But the fundamental flaw in their tools ensured that all their efforts were worthless, that every drop of water carried was ultimately wasted. The curse operated on multiple levels of meaning. On the surface, it was a punishment for murder, a cosmic balancing of the scales of justice. But deeper examination reveals it as a meditation on the nature of women who kill their husbands, on the futility of trying to fill vessels that are fundamentally flawed, on the way that certain crimes create needs that can never be satisfied. The image of the Danaids became a symbol for any futile task, any effort doomed to failure from the start. Their curse spoke to the human condition in its broadest sense, to the way that all human endeavors ultimately come to nothing, that all our efforts to create meaning and purpose are ultimately undermined by the fundamental flaws in our nature and our circumstances. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Danaids' curse is its commentary on the nature of justice itself. The punishment was not merely retribution for their crime, but a kind of cosmic joke, a demonstration that even divine justice could be arbitrary and cruel. The gods had not simply punished the Danaids. They had created a punishment that was itself a form of torture, a reminder that divine power could be used not just to maintain order, but to create new forms of suffering. The story of the Danaids raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and punishment. If the 49 sisters deserved eternal torment for their crime, what did that say about Hypermestra, who had shown mercy and saved her husband? Was her compassion a virtue or a failure of duty? The curse seemed to suggest that, in the realm of divine justice, mercy itself could be a form of rebellion against the cosmic order. Chapter 12. The Weaver Who Challenged the Gods in the Ancient City of Lydia, where the purple dye flowed like liquid royalty and the looms sang with the music of creation, there lived a young woman whose skill with thread and needle was so extraordinary that it seemed to transcend mortal capability. Arachne, daughter of a humble dyer, possessed fingers that could weave dreams into reality, hands that could capture the very essence of life in patterns of silk and gold. Her curse would transform this greatest of gifts into a prison of instinct, a punishment that would strip away everything human, while leaving only the compulsion to create. Arachne's talent was not merely technical, it was visionary, almost divine in its perfection. She could weave tapestries that seemed to breathe with life, that captured not just the appearance of her subjects, but their very souls. Birds seemed ready to fly from her fabric, flowers appeared to sway in unfelt breezes, and human figures looked so real that observers swore they could hear them speaking. Her reputation spread throughout the known world, drawing admirers from distant lands who came to witness what many called the eighth wonder of the world. But with fame came pride, and with pride came the kind of boastfulness that invariably attracts the attention of the gods. Arachne began to claim that her skills surpassed even that of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and crafts, the divine patroness of weavers everywhere. It was not enough for her to be the greatest mortal weaver. She wanted to be acknowledged as the greatest weaver in all existence, mortal or divine. The claim reached the ears of Athena, who initially could not believe that a mortal would dare to challenge her in her own domain. The goddess of wisdom decided to give Arachne a chance to recant, appearing to her in the form of an old woman and advising her to show more humility toward the gods. But Arachne, blinded by her own skill and the praise of her admirers, not only refused to back down, but actually invited the disguised goddess to a weaving contest. Confident that her abilities would prove her superiority, Athena, her divine patience exhausted, threw off her disguise and revealed herself in all her terrible glory. The contest that followed was not merely a competition between two weavers, but a battle between mortal ambition and divine authority, between human creativity and cosmic order. Both contestants set up their looms in the same chamber, the tension in the air so thick it seemed to vibrate with potential violence. Athena's tapestry was a masterpiece of divine propaganda, depicting the gods in all their glory and power. She wove scenes of divine justice, of mortals who had challenged the gods and been appropriately punished, of the natural order that placed immortals above mortals in the cosmic hierarchy. Every thread was perfect, every color precisely chosen, every detail crafted to demonstrate the superiority of divine creation. But Arachne's tapestry was something else entirely. Instead of celebrating the gods, she chose to expose their flaws, their petty cruelties, their sexual crimes against mortals. She wove scene after scene of divine injustice, Zeus's countless rapes, Poseidon's violations, Apollo's broken promises, the gods' treatment of mortals as playthings to be used and discarded. Her work was not merely technically perfect, it was emotionally devastating, a visual indictment of divine behavior that was impossible to refute. The truth of Arachne's tapestry was what made it so dangerous. Every scene she had woven was accurate. Every crime she had depicted had actually occurred. She had used her divine gift of weaving to create a work of art that was also a work of testimony, a permanent record of divine injustice that could not be denied or destroyed. In challenging Athena to a contest of skill, she had inadvertently created a challenge to the moral authority of the gods themselves. Athena, faced with a tapestry that was not only technically equal to her own, but morally superior, felt a rage that transcended normal divine anger. She had been defeated not just as a weaver, but as a representative of divine justice. The mortal had not only matched her skill, but had used that skill to expose the very flaws in the cosmic order that the gods worked so hard to conceal. The curse that Athena placed upon Arachne was not immediate death, but something far more insidious: transformation into the very thing she had used to challenge the gods. The goddess destroyed Arachne's tapestry and struck her with a shuttle. But the real punishment was the magic that began to work through her body, changing her from a woman into a spider. The transformation was gradual and horrifying. Felt her body shrinking, her limbs multiplying, her skin hardening into a chitinous shell. Her beautiful hair fell out, her eyes multiplied and relocated, her mouth transformed into mandibles designed for processing prey. But the cruelest aspect of the curse was what it preserved: her consciousness, her memories, and most importantly, her compulsion to weave. As a spider, Arachne retained her skill but lost her choice. She could still create intricate patterns, still demonstrate her mastery of thread and tension. But now she could only weave webs, simple structures designed for catching prey rather than creating beauty. The curse had transformed her greatest gift into a survival mechanism, her art into mere instinct. The curse of Arachne speaks to the dangerous relationship between human creativity and divine authority. Her punishment was not merely for pride or boastfulness, but for using her gift to challenge the moral order that the gods had established. She had demonstrated that mortal creativity could be used not just to celebrate divine power, but to question it, to expose its flaws, to create alternative visions of justice and truth. In transforming Arachne into a spider, Athena had not simply punished an individual. She had made a statement about the limits of human creativity. The curse suggested that art, no matter how skilled or beautiful, must ultimately serve the interests of power. That creativity that challenges authority will be stripped of its human dignity and reduced to mere mechanical function. The story of Arachne has resonated through the ages, because it speaks to the eternal tension between artist and authority, between creativity and control. Her curse represents the fear that haunts every artist who dares to speak truth to power, that their gift might be taken away, that their voice might be silenced, that their humanity might be sacrificed to the demands of those who rule. Yet even in her transformed state, Arachne continues to weave. Every spider's web is a reminder of her story, a testament to the persistence of creativity even in the face of divine punishment. Her curse has become a kind of immortality, ensuring that her challenge to the gods will be remembered and repeated as long as spiders spin their webs and artists dare to dream of something better than the world as it is.